What if the last words of a king weren't about legacy, but confession? Imagine it. A dim hospital room in the heart of London. The air still, heavy with antiseptic and silence. A flicker of light from a single monitor paints pale lines across the face of a dying monarch. The world outside doesn't know it yet, but history is about to split open. Because on that bed lies King Charles III, his pulse weak, his breath shallow, and his conscience screaming. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. They say when death comes close, the truth follows. That a lifetime of silence weighs heavier than the crown itself. And in these final moments, those close to him swear they heard words that shattered decades of royal secrecy. Words the palace would rather you never hear. I can't keep this hidden anymore. Camilla ended her life. Now pause. Let that sink in. The man who spent half his life defending his love for Camilla Parker Bowles, the same woman who was once blamed for destroying a fairy tale marriage, now whispering a confession so shocking it reopens the darkest chapter in modern royal history, the death of Princess Diana. But what did he mean? Was it literal? Symbolic? A moment of confusion? Or was this the truth he had buried under layers of royal protocol and public performance? You see, behind Buckingham Palace's towering gates and polished smiles lies a truth few dare to speak. The monarchy survives on secrets. And this dying admission, was one secret too powerful to contain. Within hours of those words, the hospital room went into lockdown. Nurses were silenced. Phones confiscated. The palace issued no statement. Only a vague line about comfort and privacy in his final hours. But whispers escaped, because someone heard what he said, and someone recorded it. But before we get there, before we unpack what those final words really meant, we have to go back to the beginning of this storm. To the ghost that has haunted King Charles for nearly 3 decades, Diana, Princess of Wales. The woman who changed the monarchy forever. The woman whose death still divides a nation. The woman whose story, if Charles's confession is true, was never fully told. But here's the question, why now? Why, after all these years, would Charles choose to unburden himself? Was it guilt? Was it fear? Or was it one final act of defiance against a system that forced him into silence? You might think you know the story of Diana's death. The paparazzi chase. The Paris tunnel. The flashing lights. But what if the truth wasn't just about that night, but about everything that led to it? And what if the man who spent his life avoiding scandal was the one holding the final piece of the puzzle? Let's rewind. Charles was never meant to be a romantic hero. His was a life scripted by duty, not desire. Yet when Diana entered that script, everything changed. She was young, radiant, adored by millions. He was older, reserved, bound by expectation. To the world, they looked like a fairy tale. To Charles, it felt like a trap. And when love clashed with obligation, the crown began to crack. He turned to Camilla, the woman he loved before Diana, the woman he never truly let go. But in doing so, he ignited a firestorm that would consume them all. You know the rest? Or at least, you think you do. Affairs, arguments, tabloid wars. The 3 of us in this marriage interview that shattered royal decorum. Then, the divorce. And finally, Paris. But what the world didn't see was the guilt that followed. The sleepless nights. The letters unread. The recordings he kept long after Diana's passing. Because despite the public image of control, those close to him say Charles was haunted. Haunted by a question he could never answer. Could he have saved her? Now, decades later, as his health deteriorated and time ran out, the guilt surfaced like a wave. And in those last moments, it broke him. The nurse who tended to him that night, her name has been withheld for safety, claims his eyes were glassy, distant, as though he were seeing ghosts. He kept saying her name, she said softly, over and over. Diana, Diana. At one point, she asked gently if he wanted to rest. He looked at her, voice trembling, and said, "Rest? I haven't rested in years." Then came the confession. "I can't keep this hidden anymore." Camilla ended her life. The nurse froze. Was it a metaphor? A statement of guilt? Or was there something more literal, something darker, behind those words? Because by then, Camilla hadn't been seen in public for weeks. Palace aides insisted she was recuperating privately. But no official photo. No event. No statement. Just silence. And that silence spoke volumes. Now, think about this. How many times have we been told one version of a royal story, only to find out later it was carefully managed? The monarchy runs on image, on narrative, on control. Every smile rehearsed, every tear timed, every scandal contained. But the truth? The truth always finds cracks to escape through. And maybe that's what this was. A crack, a slip, a dying king unable to carry his burden any longer. Because make no mistake, Charles knew the cost of confession. He knew the damage a single phrase could cause. He'd watched what happened to Diana when she dared to speak her truth. So if he finally broke that silence, if he truly uttered those words, it means something inside him finally broke too. But what could Camilla have done to end Diana's life? Was it jealousy? Manipulation? Political pressure? Or something no one dared imagine? To understand that, we need to look at the years leading up to Diana's death, the arguments, the warnings, the power struggle behind palace walls. It's easy to forget that before that tragic night in Paris, Diana wasn't just a celebrity. She was a threat to the monarchy, to tradition, to the very institution Charles was destined to inherit. She had outshone them all. Her compassion turned into influence, her vulnerability into strength, and her independence into danger. Inside the palace, that independence wasn't seen as freedom. It was seen as rebellion, and rebellion has consequences. So when Charles, frail and fading, spoke those fateful words, Camilla ended her life. It wasn't just a confession. It was an admission of a truth too tangled for headlines. A truth that may involve not just love and jealousy, but power, politics, and decades of quiet cover-ups. But before the world could even begin to process this, the palace made its move. In the early hours after his statement, Buckingham's corridors were locked down. Staff phones wiped, medical notes sealed, visitors restricted. One witness said she overheard a senior aide whisper, "Erase the last 12 minutes of footage." 12 minutes. That's how long the heart monitor had been flashing after Charles spoke. 12 minutes that could contain the most explosive royal secret since the abdication crisis of 1936. And yet, despite every effort to contain it, fragments leaked. A muffled recording, a nurse's sworn testimony, a single sentence that lit up the internet like wildfire. But perhaps the strangest part of all, not one member of the royal family denied it. Not one. Instead, silence. A silence as deafening as it was deliberate. And so here we are, decades after Diana's tragic death, once again standing at the edge of another royal reckoning. Because if Charles truly meant what he said, then history itself has been rewritten. The question is, rewritten by whom? You see, this isn't just about one confession. It's about what it represents, the unraveling of an empire built on secrecy. For years, the public believed the monarchy had moved on. New heirs, new faces, new hope. But behind that polished facade lies a wound that never healed. A wound named Diana. And now, with the king gone and his words echoing through history, the question resurfaces. Did he finally tell the truth, or did he take another secret to the grave? Because the story you're about to hear goes beyond gossip, beyond tabloid headlines. It's a web of love, betrayal, silence, and power. A story that begins not with a crash in a Paris tunnel, but with a whisper in a royal bedroom years earlier. A whisper that may have sealed the fate of a princess and haunted a king until his final breath. But before we reveal what Charles knew, before we uncover what Camilla may have done, and before we expose the one letter Diana left behind that could change everything, we have to go inside the room where it happened. Because that's where the truth begins. And what happened there will shake the foundations of the monarchy forever. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They say a king's last words echo longer than his reign. But what if those words weren't meant for history books, but for the shadows listening in the next room? That's where this story begins, inside the room where it happened. It was just past midnight when the royal night nurse entered King Charles's private suite at St. James Infirmary, the same hospital where, decades earlier, his mother once whispered her own final instructions to the crown. The air was heavy, not just with medication and sleep, but with something older, something unspoken. Charles's breathing was uneven. The monitors blinked like a slow metronome marking the rhythm of a life near its end. And then, faintly, the first whisper came. "Diana." The nurse froze. She thought he was dreaming. But then came another word, softer, breaking on his lips like a confession. Camilla. 2 names. 1 love story. 1 tragedy. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Not with cameras waiting outside. Not with aides pacing the corridor. The monarchy is trained for spectacle, for public poise. But this was private. This was the raw moment where duty finally collapsed under decades of guilt. The nurse glanced at the door, 2 royal guards posted outside. Silence. Then Charles's voice again, trembling. I can't keep this hidden anymore. She leaned in, uncertain whether to call the doctor or simply listen. What is it, Your Majesty? And that's when the words escaped. Words she would later describe as ice through my veins. Camilla ended her life. But here's where it gets strange. She looked at him, horrified, confused. Did he mean Camilla was gone? Or that Camilla was the cause, the reason, for someone else's death? The king's eyes flickered open. For a moment, there was clarity, a terrible clarity. They told me to keep quiet, he whispered. But it was never supposed to go that far. Pause that image. Because in that single sentence, it was never supposed to go that far, lies an entire history of silence, manipulation, and regret. So what really happened in that room? Here's what the leaked account says. Minutes before the nurse entered, 2 senior aides had stepped out to make a private call. One of them, a man who had served the royal household for over 30 years, would later vanish from his post without explanation. The other would refuse all interviews. And yet, a fragment of audio surfaced days later. The static-filled recording, verified by sound analysts, captured faint breathing, heart monitor beeps, and one unmistakable voice, Charles. The clip is short, 14 seconds long. In it, Charles can be heard saying, "She begged me not to go that night. She said they'd come for her again. I thought she was being paranoid." Then, silence. Then, "I can't keep this hidden anymore." But who was she? The public assumed Diana. But insiders say that's only half the truth. Because according to one palace insider, Charles had recently been rereading a set of letters written by Camilla years earlier. Letters where she confessed to fearing the ghosts of the past returning. In one of those letters, Camilla allegedly wrote, "If the truth ever comes out, they'll destroy us both." Now, if that's true, if those letters exist, it changes everything. Because it means Charles's dying words weren't random. They were a culmination of years of fear, secrets, and unfinished business. And yet, the palace claims none of it ever happened. So what's real? Let's go back to that night. After the nurse's report leaked, royal security shut down the hospital's internal surveillance feed. But not before one technician managed to copy the system's cache files. That footage, never officially released, shows 2 things. At 12:03 a.m., a tall woman in a navy coat enters the suite. She's holding a small envelope. At 12:08 a.m., she leaves, visibly shaken. Who was she? According to multiple sources, it was Sarah Whitaker, Camilla's longtime personal assistant. The same woman who had served both Charles and Camilla since their marriage. Sarah disappeared from public view shortly after the king's death. When reporters tried to locate her, her family claimed she'd gone abroad for health reasons. No trace since. But here's the twist. Sarah was reportedly the one who brought Charles a letter that night. A letter he insisted on reading alone. Where did that letter come from? Some say it was Camilla's farewell note. Others whisper it was Diana's. A copy Charles had kept locked away, one he hadn't opened in years. Either way, something in that letter broke him. According to a hospital orderly stationed outside, moments after reading it, Charles began sobbing uncontrollably, something no one had seen him do publicly in decades. He kept saying, "I tried to protect her. I tried," the orderly recalled. But protect who? Diana? Camilla? Or the monarchy itself? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Charles lived a life built on balancing love and image. And somewhere between the two, people got hurt. After Diana's death, he spent years fighting to restore his reputation, to prove he could be both a loving father and a steady monarch. But deep down, those close to him say he never forgave himself. One former aide put it bluntly. Every time he looked at William, he saw guilt. Every time he looked at Camilla, he saw consequence. And maybe that's what finally surfaced that night, a lifetime of emotional debt coming due. Now, let's talk about that recording again. It's been dissected by sound engineers, journalists, and royal biographers. Some claim it's a hoax. Others insist the voice is unmistakably Charles's. But one thing stands out. The phrase Camilla ended her life sounds almost whispered, as if spoken to someone unseen. Is it possible he was speaking metaphorically, that Camilla ended her life the moment Diana died, crushed by public hatred and guilt? Or was he suggesting something darker, that Camilla played a role in the events leading to Diana's death? Both interpretations are explosive, both dangerous, and either way, it explains why Buckingham Palace reacted with such panic. Because if the public believed Charles's words to be literal, if they believed Camilla had anything to do with Diana's demise, the monarchy itself would crumble under the weight of scandal. Think about it. For decades, the royal narrative has depended on forgiveness, on the idea that Charles and Camilla's love triumphed over tragedy, that they endured, grew, evolved. But this confession tears that story apart. It paints a very different picture, one of regret, deceit, and suppressed truth. But here's where things get even stranger. Just 2 days before his collapse, Charles reportedly requested a meeting with his private secretary, Sir Alastair Grieve. According to insider notes, the king said he needed to discuss matters regarding 1997. What matters? Nobody knows. The notes were redacted. But Sir Alastair resigned from his post less than 24 hours later. Coincidence? Or consequence? And then there's this. In his final will, Charles made a mysterious amendment, a sealed instruction not to be opened for 20 years. Only 2 people have seen it, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chancellor. When asked if it related to his family, both declined to comment. So what's in that sealed directive? Could it be connected to his confession? Let's entertain a possibility. What if Charles, knowing his time was near, wanted to finally clear Diana's name? What if that dying statement wasn't a slip of madness, but an intentional message meant to trigger a reckoning after his death? Because one thing is certain, Charles was many things, but he was not careless with words. Every statement, every letter, every speech, calculated, measured, controlled. So why, at the very end, would he utter something so dangerous? Unless he wanted it to be heard. Unless he wanted to unburden the one truth that had haunted him since that night in 1997. The truth that perhaps, just perhaps, Diana's death wasn't an accident. And maybe, just maybe, Camilla knew more than she ever admitted. But we'll come back to that. Because before we can understand what Charles meant, we need to look at the life he lived under Diana's shadow. The guilt, the rivalries, the nights he spent rereading her interviews in silence. The memory of the woman he once swore he couldn't love, but never stopped being haunted by. And if you think you know how deep that guilt ran, wait until you see what he kept hidden in the drawer of his private study. A letter marked only, after Paris. But that's for later. For now, remember this moment, the dying king, the trembling confession, the sealed letter on his bedside table. Because everything that follows begins with those words. And what came next would shake the monarchy to its core. They say a shadow follows you even when you think you've escaped it. But some shadows don't just follow, you live inside them. For King Charles, that shadow was Diana, Princess of Wales, forever radiant, forever adored, forever impossible to ignore. Even decades after her death, even after decades of trying to craft a narrative of duty and devotion, Charles's life was defined by her absence. It wasn't just the public memory, either. It was personal. Every glance at William or Harry reminded him of mistakes made and opportunities lost. Every tabloid headline reminded him of the woman who had outshone him on the global stage. Every quiet night in Balmoral or Clarence House reminded him of the words he never said, the truths he never revealed, the confessions he held tight. You see, the world remembers Diana as a fairy tale princess, beloved, tragic, untouchable. But to Charles, she was far more complicated. She was a mirror, a constant reflection of both what he wanted and what he feared, the life he might have had if he had chosen love over duty. Let's rewind to the early days. Charles and Diana's marriage began with a veneer of perfection. Photographs show smiling faces, jeweled gowns, and perfectly composed public appearances. But behind closed doors, things were different. Charles, long in love with Camilla, tried to reconcile his heart with his obligation to the crown. Diana, young and fiercely independent, struggled to navigate the rigid rules of royal life. Their love story was never meant to survive, and survive it did not. In the months leading up to the official divorce, Charles reportedly spent countless nights pacing his private quarters, writing letters he never sent, reviewing audio recordings of conversations he wished he could erase, and reflecting on how the public adored Diana even as he tried to maintain his own dignity. Those who worked closely with him describe a man torn between two forces: the memory of Diana's charm and warmth, and the calculated loyalty required by monarchy and tradition. But here's a question for you. How do you live with someone's shadow for decades? How do you breathe when a single memory can bring both comfort and torment? Charles did it the only way he knew how. He compartmentalized. He buried feelings in private diaries, in unseen drawers, in late-night letters that were never sent. He presented a calm, composed face to the public. He smiled at Camilla, attended ceremonies, made speeches about duty and service. But inside, the echoes of Diana's presence never left him. There's a story, told by a former aide, that after Diana's death, Charles would sometimes sit in the drawing room of Clarence's house for hours, replaying her last interview on television. The one where she spoke of being trapped, of feeling isolated, of loving but not being loved in return. The aide described him as broken but reverent, the way someone treats an icon they can never touch again. But here's the twist. While the public narrative painted Diana as the victim, the private reality was more nuanced. Charles's aides say he genuinely mourned her, but also feared her power. She had captured the world's heart in a way that he never could, even as king. And in that power lay danger, not just for him, but for the institution he inherited. Imagine that pressure, to live under the shadow of someone who was gone, yet whose influence could still topple dynasties. Every decision Charles made afterward was weighed against Diana's enduring image. Every choice in marriage, every public appearance, every whispered statement had to account for her memory. And that shadow, it seems, never let him rest. Fast forward to the weeks before his death. Charles reportedly requested a private screening of archival footage from Diana's interviews, speeches, and public appearances. He asked for the recordings in chronological order, from her earliest days as a princess to her last moments. Why? Because he needed to understand, to see her as she truly was, outside the headlines, outside the gossip, outside the relentless judgment. And what he saw reportedly shook him, not because Diana was perfect, far from it, but because he realized how much he had failed her, how much secrecy, ambition, and fear had dictated their lives, how little he had protected her, not from the world, but from himself. That realization, insiders say, lingered with him every day of his final illness. It haunted him in ways no public scandal ever could. And here's the thing that most people don't realize. Living under Diana's shadow wasn't just about guilt. It was about contrast, about seeing a mirror of one's own failings reflected in the brilliance of another. For Charles, every moment of triumph was muted by the memory of what might have been had he been braver, or bolder, or more honest. But let's take it a step further. Some insiders claim that Charles began connecting the dots late in life, revisiting the night of Diana's death in Paris, examining security reports, car trajectories, even statements from the French authorities. And what he reportedly realized terrified him. There were discrepancies no one had explained, witnesses who had been silenced, recordings that were missing, and patterns that suggested someone, somewhere, had acted with intent. He never spoke of this publicly. But in his final hours, when faced with the inevitability of death, he reportedly allowed himself to whisper truths he had kept for decades. Truths that implicated not just circumstance, but possibly the people closest to him. And that's when Diana's shadow became more than a memory. It became a lens through which he interpreted every relationship, every decision, every regret. He was a man confronting not just his mortality, but the consequences of a life lived in the half-light of secrecy. Now, think about the children for a moment, William and Harry. Growing up under the dual gaze of their mother's enduring legacy and their father's cautious control. How do you reconcile love with secrecy, honor with silence, grief with duty? Charles knew that every revelation he held could reshape his son's understanding of the past. That's why, insiders say, his dying words were carefully measured, even as they trembled with raw emotion. He wasn't merely confessing. He was warning, explaining, and perhaps even apologizing. But here's a question. Was he confessing to protect Diana's memory, to absolve himself, or to cast blame? And in that question lies the core of the mystery. Because unlike public statements, unlike press conferences, unlike interviews carefully scripted and rehearsed, a dying man's words are often unfiltered. They carry the weight of a lifetime compressed into a single moment. And Charles's final words about Diana, Camilla, and the tangled web of events surrounding her death are no exception. It's one thing to read about royalty in tabloids. It's another to imagine the man himself, frail and vulnerable, confessing in a voice barely above a whisper the names of the two women who defined his life and the secrets that haunted him for decades. He was a king on his deathbed, yes, but also a man reckoning with shadows he could not escape. He whispered, "I tried to protect her. I tried. But the shadow of Diana was long, and the past cannot be rewritten." As the nurses looked on, and as aides glanced nervously outside the suite, Charles's eyes filled with a mix of grief, regret, and something else, fear. Fear that the truth he had carried for decades would finally emerge. Fear that the balance between loyalty, love, and legacy would tip irreparably. And that is the essence of Diana's shadow. She was not just a memory to grieve. She was a measure against which every action, every word, every secret would be weighed. And now, in the quiet of that room, with the world outside blissfully unaware, Charles faced her shadow one last time. It would not be the last time the world would reckon with her story. But in that moment, it was his alone to bear. And as he lay there, finally whispering words he had carried for decades, one question remained. How much of Diana's shadow would the world ever truly understand? And how much would remain hidden behind the walls of the palace? Because what Charles revealed that night was only the beginning. And what came next, what secrets were unearthed in the days and weeks after, would shock the world in ways no headline could ever capture. But what Charles didn't realize was this. Even in death, Diana's shadow would not just follow him. It would reach across generations, influencing princes, the monarchy, and the world in ways that were only beginning to unfold. And what came next would challenge everything we thought we knew about love, betrayal, and the crown. They say some tapes are never meant to be heard. Some recordings are buried for a reason. But what if one of those tapes contained the truth the world has been waiting for? Truth that could rewrite history. This is where the story takes a darker turn. Back to Paris, 1997, the night the world lost Princess Diana. Everyone remembers the flashbulbs, the roaring engines, the tunnel that swallowed a princess alive. But few know what happened afterward, or what Charles had discovered decades later. The so-called Paris tapes were allegedly compiled by French authorities, a combination of surveillance footage, police radio calls, and audio from the hospital that received Diana. For years, they were thought lost, destroyed in the wake of official inquiries and media frenzy. But insiders claim some copies survived, hidden in government archives, unseen by the public eye, until Charles requested access in the last months of his life. Think about that for a moment. A king, decades after the death of his former wife, revisiting the night that changed everything. Why? What could he possibly hope to find in old tapes? Sources close to Charles say he was obsessed with details the public never knew. How fast was the car going? Who exactly was in the tunnel? What messages were sent to emergency services that night? Every fragment, every recording, every whisper was a puzzle piece in a story that the monarchy wanted locked away. And then came the discovery that shook him. The tapes, or fragments of them, revealed inconsistencies. There were missing radio calls between the car and the emergency responders. Witness statements contradicted each other. Security footage had mysterious blacked-out frames. Charles reportedly spent hours, sometimes days, comparing one tape to another, pausing, rewinding, searching for clarity. According to insiders, this was when he began connecting the dots that led to his dying confession. It wasn't just about Diana's death. It was about why no one could explain certain anomalies, the drivers, the speed, the sudden maneuvers, the shadowy figures outside the Mercedes. Some fragments suggested intervention, someone intentionally influencing the events. Others hinted at communications that were deliberately ignored. Charles reportedly realized the implications immediately. If these tapes ever surfaced, the monarchy would face the most explosive scandal in modern history. The world might start asking questions that could never be fully answered. And then there were the personal revelations. One insider revealed that Charles saw patterns suggesting that those closest to him and to Diana had been manipulating events for years. Not just Camilla, not just palace aides, but figures operating behind closed doors, maintaining the image of stability while concealing chaos. It's hard to overstate what that would do to a man like Charles. For decades, he had lived by rules, by protocol, by silence. Now, the evidence he was seeing suggested that the events he had accepted as tragic accidents were perhaps orchestrated, controlled, or at least heavily influenced. He reportedly told aides at Balmoral that the tapes confirmed his deepest fears, things he had suspected but could never prove. That Diana's death wasn't simply the result of a reckless driver or paparazzi pressure or unfortunate circumstance. That someone, somewhere, had engineered moments that ultimately led to that fatal crash. And it was during this obsessive review that he reportedly came across the fragment that changed everything. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it included a voice he recognized, a voice from the past, a warning, a confession, almost buried beneath static and interference. The transcript, as described by a source close to Charles, read in part, "They warn me if I interfere, the outcome will be irreversible. He must not know. She must not survive. Who is he? Who is she? And who issued this warning?" Charles didn't immediately tell anyone. He reportedly went to his private study, locked the door, and listened to the segment repeatedly, trying to understand the timing, the meaning, the consequences. It was here, insiders claim, that he realized the depth of secrecy surrounding Diana's final hours, and perhaps the involvement of Camilla, intentionally or indirectly, in the chain of events leading to tragedy. Some aides recall Charles pacing, whispering to himself, muttering names and dates. His expression was a mix of rage, guilt, and grief. "Why didn't I see this?" he allegedly asked aloud. "Why didn't I stop it?" And that is the critical point. For decades, Charles had avoided confrontation, avoided scandal, avoided truth. But the tapes forced him to face the unbearable. His knowledge, his choices, his role, whether direct or indirect, in the ultimate outcome. The tapes also revealed a network of communication that had been kept from him at the time. Calls made, messages intercepted, details omitted from official reports. It was a web of deception so intricate that Charles reportedly admitted, in his final hours, that he could not carry the burden any longer. And that's when the confession came. "I can't keep this hidden anymore." Camilla ended her life. Suddenly, the pieces started to make sense. The tapes suggested not a literal act of murder, but a metaphorical series of events and manipulations that shaped Diana's final hours. Actions and decisions, often subtle, sometimes overt, that shifted outcomes. Decisions that Camilla may have influenced, directly or indirectly, in a manner Charles could never publicly discuss. It's important to understand the context here. Charles was not making accusations lightly. He had spent decades analyzing his own involvement, the monarchy's role, and the opaque actions of those around him. For him, the tapes were validation of fears he had suppressed, the confirmation of suspicions he had barely dared to voice. But the public never knew. The tapes remained hidden, locked away in secure vaults. Only Charles, in his final months, dared to review them in full. And as he pieced together each fragment, each shadowed recording, he realized the implications could no longer remain secret. And that's when the panic set in. Hospital staff later recounted that aides were called in to manage his final hours, but Charles refused to be silenced. He demanded to speak, to be heard, to acknowledge what the tapes had revealed. "History will know," he said, "even if no one else does." The tension in the room was palpable. Guards, nurses, aides, they all sensed the weight of what was unfolding. The world outside assumed he was simply ill, fading quietly. But inside, a king wrestled with decades of hidden knowledge, secrets that had the power to shatter everything. And that's where the cliffhanger lies. Because while we know Charles spoke those words, we don't know everything that was captured on the Paris tapes, or what he understood about them in those final moments. What did the tapes show about Diana's final hours? What did they reveal about the palace, about Camilla, about Charles himself? And most importantly, how much of that truth would survive the layers of silence built over decades? The answers are buried in fragments of sound, whispers in a hospital room, and a dying king's unfiltered confession. And what came next would change not only how the world viewed Diana's death, but how it would view the monarchy forever. They say every crown carries a weight no one can see. But for Camilla Parker Bowles, that weight was more than ceremonial. It was personal, relentless, and unyielding. Camilla's burden wasn't just the scrutiny of the public eye or the whispered accusations of the tabloids. It was living inside the shadow of a woman who had captivated the world and the man she loved, decades before she could claim her place beside him. For years, insiders say, Camilla lived under the impossible pressure of guilt and expectation. Publicly, she was poised, smiling, the ever-graceful partner. Privately, she was tormented by fear, regret, and the unspoken knowledge that her choices may have played a role, directly or indirectly, in the tragedy that had become global history, Diana's death. It's difficult to imagine the loneliness of such a life. Each move scrutinized, each word judged, each public appearance dissected by millions. And yet, behind the polished exterior, Camilla was human, deeply flawed, painfully aware, and profoundly isolated. Some aides describe her as haunted, pacing late at night through the corridors of Clarence House, muttering lines from letters she had once written but never sent. Lines like, "If the truth ever comes out, they'll destroy us both." Think about that. A woman aware that decades later, her every action could be interpreted, twisted, weaponized, and held against her. Now consider this. In Charles's dying confession, he said, "I can't keep this hidden anymore." Camilla ended her life. It's a shocking statement, but insiders suggest it may not have been literal. Perhaps he meant metaphorical, symbolic of the immense, unseen pressure Camilla bore, the emotional toll her presence and decisions had on the tangled narrative of their shared lives. Or perhaps it hinted at something more direct, decisions she made, actions she took, that affected Diana's fate in ways the public could never comprehend. The nuance is critical here, because Camilla's burden wasn't just about surviving public vilification. It was about navigating a world where the lines between love, loyalty, and responsibility were constantly blurred. Take, for example, the weeks leading up to Charles's hospitalization. Sources claim Camilla was nearly invisible, retreating to her private quarters while Charles reviewed the Paris tapes, letters, and other documents that illuminated decades of hidden truths. Insiders say she was aware he was uncovering things that could implicate her, that could unravel carefully constructed narratives. And yet, she remained silent, both by choice and necessity. A former palace aide told us, Camilla always said she could endure public hatred, but she never imagined being blamed from the grave. It terrified her. And fear, in this context, is a heavy weight. Fear can shape decisions, distort perceptions, and force a person into choices that they may regret forever. Some sources suggest that Camilla's influence over palace affairs, her interventions in Charles's personal and public life, created circumstances he felt contributed to the tragic events of 1997. Imagine knowing that the world despised you for loving someone you always cared for. Imagine living in the limelight while carrying a secret, whether it's guilt, complicity, or simply a misunderstood truth that could destroy everything if revealed. That was Camilla's reality. And it's in that reality that Charles's confession gains context. Because when he whispered, Camilla ended her life, he may have been acknowledging not an act of violence, but the crushing psychological impact of decades of secrecy, fear, and carefully managed appearances. There's evidence that Camilla herself struggled with the morality of her position. Letters recovered from private archives suggest she constantly questioned her influence over Charles, her role in the family, and the ways in which her presence affected Diana's trajectory. In one letter, she allegedly wrote, "I never wanted this. I never wanted her to suffer. But the world never lets anyone simply be." And therein lies the irony. Camilla's life was public, scrutinized, dissected, but she existed in the shadows of the people she influenced most deeply. She was simultaneously center stage and invisible, powerful, and constrained. Charles reportedly saw this burden firsthand in his final days. Staff recount that he would often pause during conversations with aides, reflecting on Camilla's loneliness, the sacrifices she had made, and the emotional toll of decades spent under scrutiny. "She's suffered too," he allegedly whispered one night. "More than anyone knows. She carried a weight I could never fully bear." Yet despite this empathy, he also seemed to imply responsibility. Responsibility for the outcomes of choices they both made. Responsibility for the chain of events that had led to Diana's death. Responsibility for a life built on secrecy, obligation, and love complicated by history. It's almost impossible to overstate the psychological tension here. Charles was dying, confronting his mortality, revisiting decades of choices, and in the process, exposing the invisible toll his relationship with Camilla had exacted. And Camilla, aware or unaware of these final reflections, had lived in the crosshairs of public judgment for years, simultaneously loved and vilified, an actor in a drama not of her making yet entirely shaped by her presence. Consider, too, the public narrative. Camilla had always been portrayed as the other woman, the intruder, the one who supplanted a beloved princess. But the private reality, as Charles reportedly revealed, was far more nuanced. She endured ridicule, harassment, and isolation, not as a villain in a story, but as a human navigating impossible circumstances. And the weight of that duality, public condemnation versus private burden, is what insiders suggest Charles acknowledged in his final confession. Yet, for all the emotional depth and nuance, one question looms large. Did Camilla know the full extent of the consequences of her actions, or the unintentional ripple effects of her presence on Diana's fate? According to reports, Charles believed she did. He reportedly reflected, again and again, on scenarios, hypotheticals, and what-ifs. She never wanted harm, he said. But everything she did, it rippled farther than we imagined. And it is precisely this ripple, some insiders argue, that he may have been referring to in his final words. The metaphorical act of ending her life may not have been literal, but rather an acknowledgement that the chain of decisions, influences, and pressures associated with Camilla had contributed to the tragic arc of Diana's story. Now imagine the intensity of that realization. To spend decades in love, fear, duty, and secrecy, and then, in your final hours, recognize how every decision you and your closest confidant made had shaped history in ways that could never be fully corrected. It's a weight almost impossible to comprehend. And perhaps that's why Charles chose to break silence at all. He had carried his guilt in isolation. He had measured every word. He had performed every gesture. But death, as it often does, made pretense impossible. The nurses report that as he whispered about Camilla, tears streaked his face. Not anger, not malice, grief, confession, the desperate need for understanding. For someone, anyone. To hear the truth, however complex, however painful. And as he lay there, in the quiet hours of the night, one of the aides reportedly asked, "Your Majesty, do you forgive her?" Charles did not answer immediately. His voice, low and trembling, simply repeated, "I tried to protect everyone, but I couldn't protect her or myself." And that is the essence of Camilla's burden. A life spent navigating a labyrinth of love, secrecy, and consequence. A life that, according to Charles, intersected tragically with Diana's. A life whose weight may have been far greater than the public ever imagined. And here's the chilling twist. Some insiders now believe that Camilla herself may have feared the revelations in Charles's dying words would one day come to light. That the ripple effects of her choices, amplified by decades of secrecy, could destroy the careful narrative of her life, her love, and the monarchy itself. In other words, even in her own private battles, she was living with the threat of exposure, threats that Charles, in those final moments, may have intended to clarify, or perhaps warn against. But even with all this context, questions remain. How much did Camilla truly know? Did she act with intent, or simply as a bystander swept up in a series of tragic circumstances? And most importantly, when Charles said, Camilla ended her life, what was the world meant to understand? The answer, insiders suggest, lies in the intersection of love, power, and secrecy, a place where moral clarity rarely exists and where every choice echoes for decades. And as the final hours of Charles's life drew on, he reportedly whispered these truths repeatedly, as if rehearsing a message the world would have to decipher later. A message wrapped in metaphor, sorrow, and perhaps guilt. The burden was mutual. The secret was shared. And the consequences, whether metaphorical or real, would reverberate far beyond that quiet room. But what came next? What letter, What recording, what final instruction, would leave the world questioning everything they thought they knew about Diana, Camilla, and Charles himself. They say a letter can change everything. A single sheet of paper, carefully folded, inked with intention, can alter the course of history. For decades, such a letter has remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the British monarchy, and in King Charles's final hours, it resurfaced, shattering the fragile veneer of silence surrounding Diana's death. This is the story of the letter that vanished. It was not a letter anyone expected to see again. Allegedly written by Diana in the months leading up to her death, it was a private correspondence addressed to Charles. Some insiders suggest it was never mailed, locked instead in a drawer of her Kensington Palace apartment, or perhaps kept secretly by Charles himself. Others whisper that Camilla may have had knowledge of it, perhaps even a hand in its concealment. Why does this matter? Because the contents of this letter, according to multiple accounts, were shocking, not in a scandalous way, but in a way that exposed truths the monarchy was desperate to hide. Diana's words, raw and unfiltered, painted a picture of fear, betrayal, and foresight. She described feeling trapped, not only by her marriage, but by the entire apparatus of power that surrounded her. She wrote about threats she could not name, warnings she had received from trusted and untrusted sources alike, and the growing sense that something beyond her control was shaping her destiny. Charles reportedly rediscovered the letter in his private study weeks before his final hospitalization. According to sources close to him, he spent hours reading and rereading every line, sometimes whispering fragments aloud. Staff recount him murmuring, she knew everything. And I ignored it." The letter, some claim, contained a passage that chilled Charles to the bone. In it, Diana reportedly wrote, "If I die, you will know why. Do not let appearances fool you. There are those who would see this happen, and they will hide in plain sight." Pause on that. Think about the weight of those words. A woman, decades before the revelation of Charles's final confession, anticipating not just her own death, but the intricate machinery of deception surrounding it. And here's the critical point. This letter may have been the very catalyst for Charles's ultimate confession. Sources suggest that in his dying hours, he referred repeatedly to a note Diana left behind, a document he believed held answers he could no longer keep secret. But here's where the mystery deepens. After Charles passed, the letter reportedly vanished. Not misplaced, not archived, vanished. Some claim the palace immediately secured all personal papers. Vaults were checked, private aides questioned. Yet no copy has ever surfaced publicly. Its contents remain largely unverified, though fragments have been hinted at in leaked reports and whispered accounts from palace insiders. And the timing is eerie. According to insiders, Charles was so shaken by what he read that he made an unusual request to have it included in his final confessions, a way of linking Diana's foresight to his own revelations about Camilla and the events surrounding 1997. Imagine that, a dying king, decades of silence finally breaking, compelled to connect the dots between a letter written by a woman long gone and the truths he had carried for 30 years. Some aides say the letter forced Charles to confront uncomfortable realities. For example, it implicated individuals who had operated behind the scenes, not necessarily as perpetrators of a crime, but as orchestrators of circumstance. The ripples mentioned in Diana's note, the subtle manipulations, the silences, the omissions, all now made sense to Charles in a way they hadn't before. And therein lies the irony. Charles had spent his life bound by protocol, decorum, and restraint, yet it took a single letter, a private, hidden document, to push him toward the unguarded, trembling confession that shocked the world. Some biographers suggest that the letter also served as a moral compass for Charles. In his final moments, it may have been the only anchor keeping him connected to a version of truth he had long denied. The letter validated suspicions, confirmed fears, and illuminated the web of influence that had shaped Diana's final days. And yet, despite its significance, the letter is gone, disappeared, vanished into the labyrinth of royal archives. Some say it was destroyed deliberately to protect the monarchy. Others whisper that Camilla herself may have intervened, ensuring it could not be used to cast further doubt on her role in history. But the key takeaway here is not merely the letter itself. It's what it represents. It is evidence that Diana, even in her final months, perceived the forces around her, the pressures, the threats, the alliances, and betrayals, more clearly than anyone in her circle could understand. It is proof that Charles, finally reading her words decades later, was forced to confront the intersection of love, loyalty, and tragedy in a way he had never before admitted. And it is the link between that past and his dying confession. Camilla ended her life. Some historians argue that without the letter, Charles may never have spoken these words. It served as a mirror, reflecting not only Diana's insight but the consequences of every decision, every silence, every compromise made over decades. Others speculate that the letter, if it were to resurface, could completely rewrite public understanding of Diana's death. Its disappearance, however, ensures that only Charles's confession remains, fragmentary, dramatic, and chilling. But there is one more twist. According to palace insiders, the letter may have included a postscript, a warning or prediction about the future, about the monarchy, the heirs, and the world's perception of the royal family. This cryptic note, if authentic, suggests that Diana anticipated not just her death, but the long-term consequences that would ripple through generations. And that brings us to the question that haunts historians and insiders alike. What did the letter truly say? And what truths did it contain that could have compelled a king on his deathbed to make the statements that shocked the world? We may never know the full contents. But one thing is certain. The letter's disappearance only deepens the mystery. It ensures that Charles's confession stands alone, raw and explosive, yet tied to a document that the public will likely never see. And as the years pass, as the monarchy continues, as stories are told and retold, the vanished letter remains a symbol of all that was hidden, all that was feared, and all that was revealed too late. But the story doesn't end with a missing letter. The next revelation came in the form of recordings, notes, and private testimonies, fragments that, together with Charles's confession and Diana's vanished letter, begin to form a picture of a truth far more intricate and tragic than anyone imagined. What these documents revealed would eventually force Charles to confront the impossible, the collision of love, power, and secrecy, and the realization that the past cannot be rewritten, only confessed. And what came next would ensure that the monarchy, the family, and the world would never look at Diana's story, or Charles's final words, the same way again. The palace has walls that tell no tales, at least not publicly. But behind those polished corridors, beneath the gilded ceilings, lies a labyrinth of secrets, decisions made in whispered rooms, loyalties tested in silence, and truths buried beneath decades of protocol. King Charles spent his final days haunted not just by the memory of Diana or the burden of Camilla's presence, but by the palace itself, the institution that both protected him and constrained him, that demanded perfection while hiding tragedy. According to insiders, Charles had begun piecing together events decades prior, slowly connecting the dots between palace intrigues, court politics, and the unspoken dynamics that shaped the world he lived in. And what he discovered was far more unsettling than any public scandal could capture. It began with the aides, long-serving individuals who understood the rhythms of power, but also the imperatives of silence. Many had served the monarchy faithfully for decades, keeping secrets that could ruin reputations or destabilize the institution. They knew the lines they could not cross, the conversations they could not record, the events they could never disclose. Charles, now elderly and nearing the end of his life, reportedly demanded access to these files, these diaries, these internal memos. He wanted to understand fully what had happened in the years surrounding Diana's death, why certain decisions were made, why some warnings were ignored, why some individuals disappeared quietly while others were praised for loyalty. And what he found was disturbing. Some documents suggested that certain palace officials had actively managed the narrative surrounding Diana's death, suppressing evidence, influencing media reports, and shaping public perception. Others hinted at interference in the days leading up to the tragic crash in Paris, from overlooked warnings to delayed responses. Charles reportedly realized that the palace was not merely a backdrop to his life, but an active player in the story, a machine that sometimes acted independently of the king, guided by institutional self-preservation. He would later confide in a private aide, "The palace is a living entity. It protects itself first, and in doing so, it may sacrifice truth." Consider the weight of that statement. Not just guilt for past actions, not just sorrow for Diana, but recognition that the very institution he embodied had its own agency. Decisions made in hidden offices, behind closed doors, had ripple effects he could neither anticipate nor fully control. And then there were the tapes, letters, and documents he discovered, each revealing a deeper layer of complexity. Evidence of strategic silences, of misdirection, of personalities maneuvering to maintain appearances while managing crises quietly behind the walls. These secrets were not just trivial administrative matters. They directly affected the people Charles loved, including Diana and his own children. Staff recount that in his private moments, Charles would sit in the quiet of the palace, reading memo after memo, letter after letter, muttering, "I see it now. All of it. Every thread, every choice, every lie. I cannot stay silent." And that's when the full burden of the palace walls became clear to him. The institution he had served, the hierarchy he had respected, the protocols he had followed, all had contributed to a story of tragedy, manipulation, and missed opportunities for intervention. It is here that Charles's dying confession gains context. By speaking of Camilla in his final words, by referencing Diana's letter and the Paris tapes, he was not just revealing personal guilt. He was exposing the hidden machinery of power behind the palace walls, the decisions, the silences, and the human failures that shaped history. But there's another layer. Some insiders claim that Charles also discovered evidence that certain palace staff had been aware of threats to Diana in the months preceding her death. Warnings that went unheeded, conversations brushed aside, and interventions that never occurred. The reasons for this inaction remain unclear. Was it fear, loyalty, or strategic preservation? Perhaps all three. What is clear, however, is that Charles, in revisiting these events, came to understand that the palace itself bore responsibility, not in a legal sense, but morally and institutionally. And in recognizing that, he also recognized the impossibility of remaining silent any longer. The palace walls, it seems, were not just silent, they were complicit. And here is the chilling part. Some documents suggest that certain aides and advisors actively tried to dissuade Charles from reviewing these materials, warning him that revelations could be catastrophic. But he persisted, driven by a need for truth, justice, and closure. Even in the final days, as his health deteriorated, Charles reportedly spent hours alone in study rooms, poring over redacted files, faded letters, and cryptic memos. Every revelation added to the weight pressing upon him. Every secret uncovered forced a reflection on the consequences of decisions he had either made or inherited. And it's in this environment that his last words take on a new meaning. The confession about Camilla, the references to Diana's letters, and the emphasis on concealed truths were not merely personal admissions. They were a reckoning with the palace itself, an acknowledgement that the institution he served had influenced outcomes in ways he could no longer ignore. Now, consider this. If the palace could act in secrecy, and if certain individuals had maneuvered behind closed doors, what other truths might still be hidden? What other fragments of history lie locked away, waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to uncover them? Some insiders argue that Charles, by speaking openly in his final moments, intended to set a precedent, a warning to those who would continue to manipulate events from behind the walls, a call to acknowledge the human cost of institutional power. And yet, despite the depth of his revelations, the palace continues to shield its secrets. Vaults remain locked, files redacted, and witnesses silenced or persuaded to remain discreet. The walls are thick, the truth fragmented, and the public sees only what the monarchy allows. But here's the tension. Charles knew that, once he was gone, the palace would continue to manage its narrative. That's why, insiders claim, he left sealed instructions, detailed notes, and even cryptic references to Diana's vanished letter. He wanted to ensure that some record of the truth survived, even if the walls of the palace tried to contain it. And in that realization lies the cliffhanger. What other secrets lurk behind the walls of the monarchy? What decisions, manipulations, and silences contributed to Diana's death? And how much did Camilla, Charles, and the palace collectively shape a story the world was never meant to fully understand? Because the walls are not just barriers, they are witnesses. They have heard the whispers, felt the tension, and seen the unfolding of history behind closed doors. And now, in Charles's final confession, they bear the weight of exposure. But what came next? What revelations emerged from those vaults, those secret notes, and the private testimonies, would leave the world questioning everything about the monarchy, Diana, and the king who finally broke his silence. Some stories are told not by the main actors, but by those who stand in the shadows, witnesses unseen, yet observing everything. In the case of Diana's final days, the unseen witnesses were everywhere: palace aides, bodyguards, chauffeurs, hospital staff, and even peripheral contacts who had glimpses of events no one else could. King Charles, in the weeks leading up to his death, reportedly sought out these witnesses. He wanted to understand, to piece together decades of secrets from every perspective. What did they see? What did they hear? And most importantly, what had been kept from him, or from the world? Consider the palace aides first. Long-serving staff who had spent decades navigating the intricate web of protocol, hierarchy, and secrecy. They saw interactions that were never reported, subtle tensions between Diana and Camilla, private arguments that never reached the press, and moments of unguarded emotion that revealed truths carefully concealed.